A parcel surfaced in the Thames on a cold March morning in 1896. It should not have been there. Bargemen knew the river's rhythms, the debris, the flotsam, the occasional tragedy. But this was different. The weight was wrong. The shape too deliberate. When they pulled it from the water, the brown paper clung to something small, something that had once breathed. Inside was a baby girl. White tape wound tied around her neck. Her body wrapped carefully, almost tenderly, as if the act of murder required its own twisted ritual. But there was something else, something that would unravel one of Victorian England's darkest secrets. On the sodden paper, still visible despite the water, was an address. A name. Amelia Dyer. What the police didn't know yet, what no one could have imagined, was that this wasn't the first. This child wasn't alone in death. She was one of many. Perhaps one of hundreds. All of them had passed through the hands of a woman who smiled at desperate mothers, who promised safety and love, who collected fees and disappeared into the shadows of respectable society. How many infants had vanished into her care? The question would haunt investigators for months. Because Amelia Dyer didn't kill in rage or passion. She killed with method. With repetition. With a calculating patience that spanned decades. She built a business from the vulnerability of women who had nowhere else to turn, and she harvested that desperation until it became profitable routine. The Thames would give up more bodies in the days to come. 6 more tiny bundles. 6 more children who never had a chance. Each one strangled. Each one wrapped. Each one bearing the signature of a killer who had operated in plain sight for longer than anyone wanted to believe. This is the story of how trust became a weapon. How maternal instinct was exploited. How one woman turned the most sacred bond, between mother and child, into England's most prolific murder enterprise. And it all began with a single parcel, floating in cold water, carrying the weight of unthinkable horror. Amelia Elizabeth Dyer was born in 1837 in the village of Pile Marsh, Bristol. She came from working people, her father a shoemaker, her family respectable but unremarkable. There was nothing in her early years to suggest the darkness that would follow. She learned to read and write, unusual for a girl of her class. She trained as a nurse, a profession that demanded patience and care. She married George Thomas in 1861. They had a daughter. For a time the life was ordinary. But George's death in 1869 left Amelia a widow at 32, adrift in a society that offered women few paths forward. She had debts. She had a child to raise. She had learned, through her nursing work, about the shadowed corners of Victorian propriety. Illegitimacy was a stain that ruined lives. Women who found themselves pregnant outside marriage faced impossible choices: ostracism, poverty, the workhouse. Their children, branded bastards, carried that mark forever. Some mothers, desperate and alone, sought other solutions. They looked for women who would take their babies for a fee and raise them as their own. This was baby farming. Not all baby farmers were criminals. Some genuinely cared for the children placed in their homes. But the system was unregulated, invisible, built on transactions that happened in parlors and boarding houses where no one asked questions. Money changed hands. Babies disappeared into new lives. And sometimes they simply disappeared. Amelia learned the trade from Ellen Dane, a midwife who took in infants for adoption. She watched how it worked: the advertisements in newspapers, the meetings with anxious mothers, the promises made and fees collected. She saw how profitable it could be. How easy. In 1872, Amelia married again. William Dyer was a brewer's laborer, older than her, and willing to overlook her past. They moved frequently: Bristol, Reading, London, always renting rooms, always moving on before neighbors grew too familiar. Amelia began advertising her services. Married couple with no family would adopt healthy child, nice country home. Terms £10. The wording was careful. Respectable. The mothers who responded were servants, shop girls, women whose reputations depended on secrecy. They met Amelia in train stations and rented rooms in places where no one would remember. They handed over their infants, paid the fee, and trusted that somewhere in the countryside their children would be loved. But the children didn't go to country homes. They went to Amelia's cramped lodgings where she fed them laudanum and let them starve. The deaths came quickly. Quietly. Infants were fragile after all. They succumbed to illness, to weakness, to mysterious failures that no one questioned too closely. By the late 1870s, a doctor grew suspicious. Too many infants in Amelia's care had died. An inquest was held. She was arrested in 1879, charged with neglect. The sentence was 6 months of hard labor. It should have been a warning. It should have been an ending. Instead, it was merely an interruption. When Amelia emerged from prison, she didn't stop. She refined her methods. She learned to be more careful, more mobile, more invisible. And the killing resumed, now with the cold efficiency of someone who understood exactly how much the law could, and couldn't, see. The pattern was simple, and that simplicity made it devastating. Amelia placed advertisements in newspapers across England. The wording varied slightly, but the promise remained constant. A loving home, a married couple, a better life for an unwanted child. The fee was usually between £10 and £15, a considerable sum for a working woman, but less than the lifetime cost of raising a child in shame. Mothers responded by letter. They were domestic servants, seamstresses, factory girls who'd made one mistake and couldn't afford another. Some had been abandoned by lovers who promised marriage. Others had been assaulted by employers. All of them were desperate for discretion. Amelia arranged meetings in train stations or respectable boarding houses. She arrived well-dressed, maternal, reassuring. She asked questions about the child's health, cooed over the baby, promised updates and visits. The mothers, already breaking under the weight of their secret, wanted to believe her. Needed to believe her. Money changed hands. The baby changed arms. And Amelia disappeared. She took the infants back to whatever lodging she currently occupied. Reading, Cardiff, Bristol, the cheaper districts of London. She didn't feed them properly. She administered laudanum, a common opiate available in any chemist shop, marketed for teething pain and restlessness. In small doses it soothed. In larger doses it sedated. In the doses Amelia used it killed. Some babies died within days. Others lasted weeks, growing weaker until their small bodies simply stopped. Amelia registered the deaths as natural. Infants were fragile, prone to mysterious illnesses, and Victorian death rates for children were high enough that a few more attracted little attention. When the babies died, she sold their clothing. Kept the brass buttons and better fabrics for pawning. The bodies she disposed of in rivers, or paid undertakers for paupers' graves, or simply wrapped them in packages and left them in quiet corners where they'd be found but not traced. The mothers, if they inquired, received letters filled with reassurances. Your dear boy is thriving. She took her first steps today. He asks about you. The correspondence eventually stopped, and the mothers, already isolated by their secret, had no way to verify, no recourse to demand proof. Amelia understood something fundamental about Victorian society. Shame was its own prison. The women who gave her their children couldn't risk exposure by going to authorities. They'd entrusted their deepest secret to her, and that trust bound them to silence even when doubt crept in. By the early 1890s she perfected the system. She moved constantly, used multiple names, Mrs. Thomas, Mrs. Harding, Mrs. Stewart, and left no trail that could connect the babies she collected to the bodies occasionally found in rivers or unmarked graves. She'd been killing for nearly 20 years. And no one had stopped her. The 1890s brought a new urgency to Amelia's operation. She was in her 50s now, aging and increasingly dependent on alcohol. Her husband William, complicit or willfully ignorant, moved with her from town to town. Her daughter Polly, now grown, sometimes assisted in collecting babies or forging correspondence. The enterprise had become almost familial in its efficiency. But the volume increased. Where Amelia had once taken 1 or 2 infants per month, she now accepted 4, 5, sometimes more. The advertisements appeared in provincial newspapers across England, the Bristol Times, the Cheltenham Looker-On, the Western Daily Press. Each one carefully worded to attract the desperate while maintaining respectability. Married couple with no encumbrance would adopt healthy child. Terms moderate. The mothers came from everywhere. Barnsley sent Evelina Marmon with her infant daughter Doris in January 1896. Another woman traveled from Cheltenham with Harry Simmons, a baby boy barely 4 months old. They met Amelia at train stations, respectable locations where a woman traveling with a child drew no suspicion. She carried a carpet bag for the infants, spoke kindly, promised regular letters. The money was always collected up front. £10. Sometimes more if the mother could afford it. Amelia promised it would cover clothing, food, medical care. She promised love. None of it was true. The babies went to lodgings in Reading, where Amelia had taken rooms at 45 Kensington Road under the name Mrs. Thomas. The house was cramped, cluttered with second-hand furniture and piles of correspondence. Neighbors heard crying, brief, soon silenced. They saw Amelia carrying bundles at odd hours, noticed how infants arrived but never seemed to stay long. One neighbor, Mrs. Smith, grew suspicious enough to mention it to her husband. But what was there to report? Baby farming wasn't illegal. High infant mortality was tragic but common. Aunt Amelia, when confronted, had explanations. The babies had been collected by relatives or moved to better country homes, or sadly passed from illness despite her best care. Mothers began writing for updates. Some of the letters reached Amelia, who responded with vague reassurances. Others went to addresses that didn't exist, or to lodgings Amelia had already abandoned. A few mothers tried to visit. They found empty rooms, landlords who'd never heard of Mrs. Thomas, neighbors who couldn't remember the woman they described. Police received occasional inquiries. A mother in Cheltenham worried about her son. A servant in Bristol asked questions about her daughter. But the complaints were scattered across jurisdictions, filed by women too ashamed to push hard, involving transactions that existed in legal gray areas. No single detective saw the pattern. No one connected the disappearances. Amelia's mistake came from routine. She'd disposed of so many bodies in so many rivers that the method became automatic. In late March 1896, she wrapped the body of baby Doris Marmon in brown paper, the same thick wrapping paper she'd bought in bulk. She tied it with string, secured it with the white tape she used for strangulation, and she threw it in the Thames near Reading. But this time she'd left something visible. This time, careless or rushed or too drunk to notice, she'd used wrapping paper that bore her address. Mrs. Thomas, 45 Kensington Road, Reading. The paper was visible enough, clear enough, traceable enough. On March 30, 1896, when a bargeman named Charles Humphreys pulled that parcel from the water and unwrapped it to find the strangled body of a baby girl, he didn't just find a victim. He found a clue. And that clue, that single visible address on sodden brown paper, would finally unravel the whole terrible enterprise. The police would trace it within hours. They'd arrive at 45 Kensington Road that same day. And what they found there would confirm what the scattered suspicions had been suggesting for years. Amelia Dyer wasn't just a negligent baby farmer. She was a serial killer who'd been operating in plain sight for decades. Detective Inspector Anderson of the Thames Valley Police stood in the cramped lodgings at 45 Kensington Road and understood immediately that this was worse than anyone had imagined. The address on the wrapping paper had led them here within hours of the body's discovery. When they knocked, Amelia wasn't home. The landlord let them in. What they found made the scope of her operation horrifyingly clear. Piles of letters covered a desk near the window. Correspondence from mothers asking about their children. "How is my darling boy? Please send word of her health. I enclose a postal order for her keep." Some letters were dated months earlier. None had been answered. In drawers, police found pawn tickets, dozens of them for baby clothes, infant shoes, small blankets. Amelia had sold everything. The brass buttons from children's coats. The bonnets mothers had carefully selected. Even the blankets infants had been wrapped in when handed over. There were telegraph forms too, blank but ready to use for arranging meetings with mothers. Newspaper clippings of her own advertisements. A carpet bag that reeked of laudanum. And most damning, rolls of white tape, the same tape that had been wound around baby Doris's neck. Anderson ordered a search of the Thames. If one body bore Amelia's address, there might be more. Over the next week, the river gave up its dead. 6 more parcels surfaced between Reading and Henley. Each contained an infant's body. Each had been strangled with white tape. Each showed signs of neglect. The babies were underweight, their clothing cheap and insufficient. The brown paper wrapping was identical across all the packages, likely from the same bulk purchase. Medical examinations confirmed what investigators suspected. The infants had been deliberately killed. The tape marks on their necks showed consistent patterns, pulled tight, knotted, left in place until death occurred. Some bodies showed traces of drugs in their systems, though decomposition made exact identification difficult. The oldest bodies had been in the water for weeks. The most recent, baby Doris, had been submerged less than 24 hours. Police issued warrants for Amelia Dyer, her husband William, and her daughter Marion Palmer, known as Polly. They were found on April 3 in lodgings at 76 Mayo Road, in the working-class district of Willesden. Amelia answered the door calmly, almost as if she'd been expecting them. She was 57 years old, gray-haired, stout, her face lined with years of alcohol and stress. She showed no surprise, no fear. Just a strange resignation, as if the inevitable had finally arrived. "I knew you'd come," she reportedly said. At the police station, detectives laid out the evidence. The letters from mothers. The pawn tickets. The tape. The bodies pulled from the Thames. Amelia listened to all of it with an expression that shifted between defiance and exhaustion. Initially, she denied everything. The babies had died of natural causes. She'd panicked and disposed of the bodies improperly, but she hadn't killed them. It was an admission of wrongdoing but not of murder. Then, as hours of interrogation wore on, her story shifted. She admitted to causing some deaths, through neglect, through accidents, through desperation when she couldn't care for so many infants. But she claimed it wasn't intentional. She'd been overwhelmed. She'd made terrible mistakes. The evidence told a different story. Police traced her movements over the previous months. They found more lodgings she'd rented under false names. More landlords who remembered babies arriving and mysteriously disappearing. More advertisements in provincial newspapers, each one promising care and love while delivering death. Witnesses came forward. A chemist in Reading remembered selling large quantities of laudanum to a woman matching Amelia's description. A pawnbroker identified items he'd purchased from her, baby clothes, infant shoes, all sold shortly after she'd accepted new children. Mothers began contacting police, desperate for information. Evelina Marmon confirmed that the clothing found on baby Doris matched what she'd last seen her daughter wearing. Another mother identified a bonnet recovered from the Thames as belonging to her son Harry. These weren't anonymous victims. They were children with names, with mothers who'd loved them enough to seek better lives for them, who'd trusted the wrong person. As detectives compiled the evidence, a horrifying timeline emerged. Amelia had been taking babies since the early 1870s, over 20 years of systematic killing. The numbers were staggering. 6 bodies from the Thames. Dozens of missing children whose mothers had lost contact. Hundreds of advertisements placed over 2 decades. How many had she killed? The police would never know the exact number. Bodies decomposed, disappeared, were buried in unmarked graves. But conservative estimates suggested at least 100 infants. Other investigators believed the number was far higher, perhaps 300, perhaps 400. Amelia Dyer wasn't just a murderer. She was one of the most prolific serial killers in British history. And she'd hidden in plain sight, disguised as a respectable woman offering maternal care, for longer than most of her victims had been alive. The trial of Amelia Dyer opened at the Central Criminal Court, the Old Bailey, on May 21, 1896. The courtroom was packed. Public interest had reached fever pitch. Newspapers across Britain covered every detail of the Reading baby farmer, as she'd become known. Outside the courthouse, crowds gathered, eager for glimpses of the woman who'd killed so many children. Amelia stood in the dock dressed in black, her face impassive. She'd gained weight in custody, her gray hair pinned back, her hands clasped in front of her. She looked, many observers noted, like someone's grandmother. Harmless. Ordinary. The prosecution was led by Mr. Horace Avery, who would later become a judge. His task was straightforward but grim: prove that Amelia Dyer had deliberately murdered at least one infant. The Crown had chosen to prosecute for the death of Doris Marmon, the baby pulled from the Thames with Amelia's address on the wrapping paper. It was the clearest case, the most traceable, the most provable. Evelina Marmon took the stand first. She was 25, a barmaid from Barnsley, and she wept as she described meeting Mrs. Thomas, Amelia, at Paddington Station in January. She'd handed over her 4-month-old daughter and £10. She'd received one letter afterward claiming Doris was well. Then silence. When police showed her the clothing recovered from the Thames, she identified it immediately. The white nightgown. The small bonnet. She collapsed in the witness box and had to be helped from the courtroom. Medical evidence followed. Dr. Maurice Crees described the autopsy. Baby Doris had been strangled with white tape, the ligature pulled so tight it had bruised the soft tissue of her neck. There were no signs of disease or natural illness. The cause of death was deliberate asphyxiation. Police testified about the search of Amelia's lodgings. The letters from mothers. The pawn tickets. The rolls of tape matching the murder weapon. The carpet bag smelling of laudanum. Anderson described Amelia's shifting statements during interrogation. First denial, then admission of neglect, then claims of memory loss. The prosecution presented evidence of other bodies pulled from the Thames. Harry Simmons. An unidentified infant boy. Another girl whose name was never determined. All bore the same white tape. All had been wrapped in identical brown paper. All connected to Amelia through witness testimony or recovered letters. Amelia's defense attorney, Mr. Capadia, attempted an insanity plea. He argued that Amelia suffered from mental instability, exacerbated by alcoholism and the stress of poverty. He called no medical experts to support this claim. None were willing to testify on her behalf after reviewing the evidence. Instead, Capadia focused on Amelia's statements to police, particularly one she'd made days after her arrest. "I don't know what possessed me to do it." He argued this showed she'd acted without rational control, that her crimes were the product of a diseased mind rather than calculated intent. The prosecution countered with the evidence itself. The advertisements carefully worded. The false names and addresses. The systematic disposal of bodies. The sale of victims' clothing for profit. These were not the actions of someone insane. They were the actions of someone who understood exactly what she was doing and took steps to avoid detection. Amelia herself testified briefly. She appeared confused, claiming she couldn't remember details, that everything was foggy. But under cross-examination, her memory sharpened when discussing finances, addresses, and practical matters. The jury watched her carefully, saw the calculation beneath the performance. The trial lasted only 2 days. The judge, Mr. Justice Hawkins, instructed the jury clearly. If they believed Amelia had deliberately strangled Doris Marmon, they must return a guilty verdict. Insanity required proof of inability to distinguish right from wrong. Amelia's attempts to hide evidence, her use of aliases, her careful planning, all suggested she knew her actions were criminal. The jury retired to deliberate. They were gone 4.5 minutes. When they returned, the foreman stood and delivered the verdict. Guilty of willful murder. Amelia showed no reaction. She didn't weep or protest or plead. She simply stood, hands folded, as Justice Hawkins placed the black cap on his head, the traditional symbol that he would now pass sentence of death. Amelia Elizabeth Dyer, he said, his voice carrying through the silent courtroom, you have been convicted of the willful murder of an infant child. The sentence of this court is that you be taken hence to a lawful prison, and from there to a place of execution, where you will be hanged by the neck until you are dead. Still, Amelia showed nothing. No remorse. No fear. Just the same blank expression she'd worn throughout the trial, as if the verdict were merely one more inconvenience in a life filled with them. Amelia Dyer spent her final weeks in the condemned cell at Newgate Prison. She was watched constantly, standard procedure for prisoners awaiting execution, to prevent suicide attempts. She wrote letters, to her husband, to her daughter, to her son. Some contained expressions of regret. Others were practical, discussing finances and possessions. To the prison chaplain, she made a confession that would haunt investigators. You'll know all mine by the tape around their necks, she said. It was an admission that went beyond the 6 bodies recovered from the Thames. It suggested a signature, a consistent method used across dozens, perhaps hundreds, of killings. When pressed for details, she claimed she couldn't remember specific numbers or names. The children blurred together in her memory. But she admitted the murders had spanned decades, that she perfected the method over years of repetition. Strangulation was quick, quiet, left no blood to clean. The tape was cheap, disposable, effective. She showed no genuine remorse. What she expressed was closer to resignation, an acknowledgement that she'd been caught, that the consequences were inevitable. When asked why she'd done it, her answers were mercenary. The money, the ease of it, the fact that no one cared enough to notice. The execution was scheduled for June 10, 1896, at 9 a.m. That morning, Amelia walked calmly to the scaffold. The executioner was James Billington, experienced and efficient. Witnesses, prison officials, doctors, the chaplain, gathered in the execution shed. Amelia's last recorded words were mundane. She asked the hangman to make it quick. He obliged. The drop was swift. Her neck broke cleanly. She was pronounced dead within minutes. Outside Newgate, a crowd had gathered, as they often did for high-profile executions. When the black flag was raised, the signal that the execution had been carried out, a murmur went through the assembled people. Some cheered. Others stood silent. A few mothers wept for the children who would never have justice. The reaction across Britain was visceral. Newspapers printed every detail of the case, the trial, the execution. Public opinion was overwhelmingly supportive of the death penalty in this case. Amelia Dyer had violated something fundamental, the trust between caregivers and the vulnerable. She'd weaponized maternal instinct and turned it into profit. Mothers began coming forward with stories. Women who'd given children to baby farmers years earlier, who'd lost contact, who now wondered if their infants had ended up in Amelia's care. The police received dozens of inquiries, but most couldn't be verified. Too much time had passed. Records didn't exist. Bodies were never recovered. The best estimates suggested Amelia had killed between 200 and 400 infants over a 20-year period. Some researchers believe the number was even higher. But the true count would never be known. Most of her victims remained nameless, their deaths recorded only in whatever conscience Amelia possessed, if any at all. What remained was the horror. the knowledge that such evil had existed, hidden in plain sight for so long. And the haunting question, how many other Amelia Dyers were operating still in the shadows of Victorian propriety? The case of Amelia Dyer exposed failures at every level of Victorian society. It revealed how stigma around illegitimacy created conditions where vulnerable women had no safe options. How lack of regulation allowed predators to operate within systems designed to help. How poverty forced impossible choices, and how some people exploited that desperation without mercy. Within a year of Amelia's execution, Parliament passed the Infant Life Protection Act of 1897. The law required anyone fostering 2 or more infants under 5 years old to register with local authorities. It mandated regular inspections and criminal penalties for those who operated without registration. Baby farming didn't disappear, but it became harder to hide. Modern criminologists study Amelia Dyer as a case of serial murder motivated by profit rather than psychological compulsion. Unlike many serial killers who are driven by sexual gratification or power, Amelia killed for money. Her victims were interchangeable to her, commodities in a transaction that ended in murder. This made her both more predictable and more dangerous. Her pattern was consistent, her method refined over decades of practice. She remains one of Britain's most prolific serial killers, yet she's relatively unknown compared to contemporaries like Jack the Ripper. Perhaps because her victims were society's most invisible, unwanted infants born to desperate women. Perhaps because her crimes exposed uncomfortable truths about Victorian morality and the consequences of stigma. The children she murdered have no collective memorial. A few, like Doris Marman and Harry Simmons, are remembered by name because their mothers testified. The rest remain anonymous.
Their only monument is the dark chapter they represent in criminal history, a reminder that the most vulnerable need the most protection, and that trust, once weaponized, becomes the deadliest tool of all. In the end, Amelia Dyer's legacy is measured in absences. In the lives never lived. In the mothers who never recovered from their trust betrayed. In the hundreds of children whose names we'll never know.